"Pack your things, you're fired." Those were the first words my boss said after I walked into the conference room. No warning, no conversation, no private meeting. Just 4 words, spoken loudly enough that everyone sitting around the table heard them. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The room was filled with department directors, HR, and several account managers who had worked beside me for years. My boss, Daniel, folded his hands on the conference table as if he had just announced next week's meeting schedule instead of ending someone's career. I looked around the room. Nobody would meet my eyes. I had worked at one of Chicago's largest marketing agencies for 4 years. For the last 3 of them, I had managed our biggest client, an account worth $18 million a year. The irony? That same account had generated the highest revenue in the entire agency just the previous month. Yet somehow, I was supposedly being fired for performance issues. If you'd asked me a year earlier whether something like this could happen, I would have laughed. I believed hard work mattered. I believed results spoke for themselves. I believed loyalty was worth something. It turns out results make you valuable. They don't always make you popular, especially when your success belongs to someone else's ego. My name is Megan Carter. At the time, I was a senior account manager. Most people outside the marketing industry think the job is mostly emails and PowerPoint presentations. In reality, it meant becoming part strategist, part therapist, part firefighter. You didn't just manage advertising campaigns, you managed relationships, and relationships were everything. The client I handled wasn't simply our biggest account. They were the reason several departments stayed busy year-round. Their campaigns touched nearly every team in the agency. Creative, media, analytics, production, social. Everyone knew the account mattered. What most people didn't know was how fragile that relationship had been before I inherited it. The client had nearly left. They were frustrated with missed deadlines, poor communication, and constant turnover. When I took over, I spent months rebuilding trust. I flew out for emergency meetings, answered calls on weekends, sat with their CEO until midnight during a product launch after a technical issue threatened the campaign. Nobody asked me to do that. I did it because I believed partnerships weren't built during easy weeks. They were built during disasters. Slowly, things changed. Campaign performance improved. Sales climbed. Our meetings became conversations instead of arguments. Eventually, the client stopped asking whether someone from the agency could join meetings. They started asking specifically whether I would be there. At first, Daniel loved that. He told everyone I was an example of excellent client management. He praised me in quarterly reviews. He even introduced me to new hires by saying, "If you want to learn how to build trust, watch Megan." Looking back, I think everything changed the moment our client stopped treating him as the primary point of contact. The first time I noticed it was during a leadership meeting. The client's CEO had joined a video call. Daniel spent 10 minutes presenting new growth projections. When he finished, the CEO smiled politely. "Sounds good," he said. Then he looked at me. "Megan, what's your opinion?" I answered honestly. The CEO nodded. "That's why I wanted your perspective." Daniel's smile disappeared for just a second. Most people missed it. I didn't. After that meeting, he stopped inviting me to certain internal strategy sessions. When I asked why, he shrugged. "Leadership discussions." "But I lead the account." "You manage it." He emphasized the word. "I lead the business." It sounded small, almost insignificant. Except those little comments kept happening. Whenever executives complimented me, Daniel redirected the conversation toward team effort. Whenever the client praised our partnership, he reminded everyone that relationships belong to the agency, not individuals. On paper, he was right. In reality, people trust people, not logos. The tension grew quietly. He began questioning decisions he'd previously approved. He copied senior executives on harmless emails. He criticized presentations he'd already reviewed, nothing serious enough to report. Just enough to make every day heavier than the one before. One afternoon, another account manager closed my office door. "Can I tell you something without you getting mad?" "Sure." "I think Daniel feels threatened." I laughed. "By me? You have the biggest client." "So? They call you directly." "That's my job." She hesitated. "I don't think he sees it that way." I dismissed it. I shouldn't have. About 2 months later, the client invited me to attend a strategic planning retreat. Daniel wasn't included. He insisted on coming anyway. During one meeting, he interrupted the CEO 3 different times. Finally, the CEO smiled politely. "Daniel, if you don't mind, I'd like Megan to finish. She's been working with us on this initiative since the beginning." The room became painfully quiet. On the flight home, Daniel barely spoke. Monday morning, everything felt different. He stopped saying good morning. Stopped asking for updates. Stopped pretending. Then the performance reviews started. Suddenly, I was receiving criticism over things that had never been mentioned before. I was too independent. Too close to the client. Not collaborative enough. I remember staring at the evaluation. Too close to the client? That was literally my responsibility. When I challenged him, he leaned back in his chair. "Don't confuse being useful with being irreplaceable." I answered carefully. "I've never said I was." "You don't have to." His expression hardened. "You act like this place couldn't survive without you." "No." I stood. "I act like the client deserves consistency." He smiled. "There it is." "What? You think you're the account?" I shook my head. "I think relationships matter." He didn't respond. Instead, he closed the folder. Meeting over. The weeks after that became unbearable. Projects I normally approved were reassigned. Junior employees were instructed to bypass me. Meetings appeared on my calendar only after they ended. It wasn't obvious enough for outsiders. But when you're the one living it, you know. I started documenting everything, not because I expected to sue anyone, because something felt wrong. One Friday afternoon, the client's CEO called me unexpectedly. "Megan, quick question." "Of course." "If anything ever changed internally." He paused. "Would you tell me?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I'm just asking." "I've always been honest with you." "I know." Another pause. "That's why I'm asking." At the time, I assumed he was talking about campaign changes. I had no idea that conversation would matter so much later. 3 weeks after that came the meeting. The one that started with 4 unforgettable words. "Pack your things, you're fired." HR slid a folder across the table. Daniel explained that the agency was moving in a different direction. He claimed my communication style had become misaligned with leadership expectations. It sounded rehearsed. Probably because it was. I didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't raise my voice. I simply listened until he finished. Then I closed my laptop, placed it carefully into my bag, stood up, and asked one question. "Did you tell the client?" Daniel actually smiled. "The client works with this agency." He leaned back confidently. "Not with you." Several people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. I nodded once. "Understood." I picked up my bag, walked to the door, then stopped. "I genuinely hope you're right." No one said a word as I walked out. The elevator ride felt strangely peaceful. Not because I wasn't hurt. I was. I'd given 4 years of my life to that company. But underneath the disappointment was something else. A feeling I couldn't quite explain. Like a puzzle piece was missing. As soon as I reached the parking garage, my phone rang. The caller ID showed the CEO of our biggest client. I answered. "Hi, Megan?" His voice sounded calm. "I just heard." I froze. "Already?" "I have people who keep me informed." Neither of us spoke for a moment. Finally he asked, "Are you all right?" "I honestly don't know yet." "I have one question." "Okay. When does our contract expire?" I knew the answer immediately. "Next week." "Correct." He exhaled slowly. I'd like you to meet me Monday morning. My heartbeat quickened. Why? Because there are some things you deserve to know. I glanced back toward the building I just left. What things? Another pause. Then he said quietly, 6 months ago, I had a conversation with Daniel that apparently he never shared with you. Every instinct I had told me to stay silent. So I did. I told him, the CEO continued, that if we renewed our $18 million partnership, there was one condition. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. What condition? That you remained our account manager. I closed my eyes. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. He never told me. No. The CEO's voice became firmer. And, judging by today's decision, he ignored it. I looked back at the office one last time. Inside that building, Daniel probably believed he'd removed his biggest problem. He had no idea what Monday was about to bring. And as I drove away, one thought kept repeating in my head. By this time on Monday morning, everyone in that boardroom would finally understand who had really been keeping the company's biggest client. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, and I stepped out. Conversations stopped almost immediately. A few people looked confused. Others looked relieved. Several simply stared, clearly wondering why someone who had been terminated 3 days earlier was walking toward the boardroom with complete confidence. Daniel was standing near the conference room door, talking with 2 senior executives. The moment he saw me, his expression tightened. Megan, Daniel, you don't work here anymore. I know. Then why are you here? Before I could answer, the elevator chimed again. The CEO of our biggest client stepped onto the floor with 2 members of his executive team. He walked directly toward us without hesitation. Good morning, Megan. Good morning. Then he turned to Daniel. I believe we're ready. Daniel forced a polite smile, though I could already see uncertainty creeping into his face. I wasn't expecting Megan to be here. I was, the CEO replied evenly. He gestured toward the conference room. Shall we? No one said another word as we walked inside. The agency president, the CFO, several vice presidents, and members of senior management were already seated around the table. They looked from me to Daniel, silently trying to understand why I was back. The client's CEO remained standing instead of taking a seat. He placed a slim folder on the conference table. I'd like to begin with one question. Daniel nodded confidently. Of course. The CEO looked around the room before settling his gaze on Daniel. Where is Megan? Daniel answered without hesitation. As I said outside, Megan is no longer with the agency. I understand that's what happened. The CEO's tone remained calm. My question is different. He leaned forward slightly. Why? Daniel straightened his jacket. We made a management decision based on performance. The room became noticeably quieter. Performance? The CEO repeated. Yes. We determined it was time to move in a different direction. The CEO slowly opened the folder in front of him. I brought copies of our correspondence from 6 months ago. He slid several documents across the table. The agency president picked one up. His eyes moved down the first page. Then he frowned. I don't remember seeing this attachment. You should have, the CEO replied. It contains the renewal condition we discussed during our last contract review. Daniel's confident expression faded. The agency president looked up. What condition? The CEO answered without taking his eyes off Daniel. That Megan Carter remained our account manager. That Megan Carter remained our account manager. The words settled over the room like concrete. No one spoke. For the first time since I'd walked into the building, Daniel looked genuinely uncertain. He straightened in his chair and forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. With respect, he said carefully, our agency has always assigned teams to accounts. Megan was a valued employee, but we have talented people who can step in. The client CEO didn't interrupt him. He let Daniel finish. Then he folded his hands on the table. That's exactly where you misunderstood us. Daniel frowned. Our company hired your agency, he replied. You did. But we stayed because of Megan. The agency president slowly lowered the papers in front of him. I need to understand something. He looked toward the client's CEO. Are you saying the renewal depended entirely on one account manager? I'm saying it depended on trust. The CEO glanced at me. For 3 years, whenever something went wrong, Megan called before we had to ask questions. When deadlines moved, she adjusted. When our executive team challenged campaign strategy, she came prepared. And when your agency made mistakes, she never hid behind excuses. He turned back to Daniel. That's rare. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I wasn't aware the relationship had become that personal. It wasn't personal. It was professional. There's a difference. The CFO spoke next. Daniel, did you ever tell anyone about this condition? Daniel hesitated just long enough to answer the question without saying a word. The agency president's face tightened. You didn't. I believed I could resolve the situation. By firing the person the client specifically asked to keep? Daniel's voice became defensive. I honestly believed they were committed to the agency. The CEO nodded once. We were... Until Friday. Silence returned. The agency president looked exhausted. So where does that leave us? The CEO slid another document across the table. Our legal department reviewed the agreement over the weekend. He paused. We've decided not to renew the $18 million contract when it expires next week. The words hit the room harder than anyone expected. One vice president actually leaned back in his chair, as if someone had taken the air out of him. The CFO closed her eyes. Daniel stared across the table. You're ending the partnership? We're ending this partnership. There has to be a way to fix this. There was. The CEO looked toward me. It walked out of this building on Friday, carrying a cardboard box. No one argued with that. For several seconds, all I could hear was the faint hum of the projector mounted on the ceiling. The agency president finally stood. I owe you an apology. The CEO nodded politely. I appreciate that. I also owe one to Megan. He turned toward me. I should have asked more questions. I met his eyes. I wish you had. There wasn't any anger in my voice, just honesty. The meeting ended a few minutes later. No one shook Daniel's hand. No one congratulated him on making a difficult leadership decision. People simply gathered their folders and walked out in silence. The client CEO waited by the door. Megan, would you join us for breakfast? I smiled. I'd like that. We walked to a nearby hotel where the client's executive team had reserved a private meeting room. The atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Nobody was trying to prove anything. Nobody was assigning blame. Instead, they asked questions. Not about the agency, about me. What did you enjoy most about managing our account? What frustrated you? If you could redesign the relationship from scratch, what would you change? At first, I assumed they wanted feedback before selecting a new agency. Then the CEO smiled. You still think we're interviewing marketing firms, aren't you? No. He pushed a folder toward me. We're interviewing you. I opened it. Inside was a formal employment offer. Vice President of Client Strategy. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood. I don't. I looked up. This can't be serious. It is. One of the board members laughed. We've talked about recruiting you for almost a year. We didn't, because we respected your commitment to your employer. The CEO nodded. But Friday changed everything. I looked back down at the offer. It wasn't just the title. It was the trust behind it. You already know our business, the CEO said. You know how we think. You know where we've succeeded. And you know where we've failed. We don't want another vendor. We want a leader. I took a slow breath. I'd be honored. Leaving one company and joining another wasn't as simple as changing business cards. There were weeks of meetings, planning sessions, new teams, New responsibilities. The title sounded impressive. The work was even harder. Instead of managing one major client relationship, I was suddenly helping shape the company's entire client strategy. There were days I questioned whether I belonged there, then I'd remember something. For years I'd already been doing much of the work. The only difference was that someone had finally recognized it. The first major initiative I led launched ahead of schedule. The second exceeded every performance target. By the end of my first year, our client retention rate had reached its highest level in company history. Success didn't happen because I wanted revenge. It happened because I focused on the work instead of the people who had underestimated me. I heard bits and pieces about my former agency through people who still worked there. Losing the $18 million account forced difficult conversations. Leadership ordered an independent review of major account decisions. They discovered communication failures that had nothing to do with a single contract. Important client requests hadn't always been shared with executive leadership. Documentation procedures were inconsistent. Too much authority had been concentrated in too few hands. Policies changed. Approval processes changed. Leadership changed. Daniel wasn't part of those changes for very long. I never asked what happened after that. By then, my attention was somewhere else. Almost 2 years later, Human Resources sent me a calendar invitation. Candidate interview. Senior Strategy Manager. I reviewed the resume before the meeting. Halfway down the page, I stopped. I recognized the name. It belonged to the person Daniel had hired after firing me. I remembered meeting him briefly before I left. He'd looked nervous. None of what happened had been his fault. When he walked into my office, he froze. "Megan!" I stood and smiled. "Good morning!" He looked genuinely embarrassed. "I didn't know you worked here." "I do. And you're the hiring manager." He laughed awkwardly. "Well, this is unexpected." "It probably is." We sat down. Before I asked the first interview question, he spoke. "I've wanted to apologize for a long time." "You don't owe me one." "I accepted a position that should never have existed." "You accepted a job that was offered to you." "Those aren't the same thing." I appreciated his honesty. "I found out what really happened a few months after I started," he continued. "The client left. People talked. I realized there was a lot I hadn't been told." I nodded. "I'm sure there was." "I almost canceled today's interview." "Why?" He smiled sheepishly. "I figured you'd remember me." I did. And I also remembered that you didn't make the decision." Relief spread across his face. The interview lasted nearly an hour. He was thoughtful, prepared, respectful. When it ended, I stood and shook his hand. "No matter what happens today," I said, "don't ever let someone else's poor leadership convince you that your career has to follow the same path." He smiled. "I won't." A week later, we offered him the position. He accepted. He became one of the strongest managers on my team. Sometimes the best way to prove you've grown isn't by shutting a door on someone. It's by refusing to repeat the mistakes that hurt you. Every now and then, someone asks me whether I regret staying at my old agency for as long as I did. The answer surprises them. No. Because those 4 years taught me something no promotion ever could. Titles can be taken away. Offices can be reassigned. Someone can even tell you to pack your things and leave. But real professional trust isn't printed on a business card. It's earned one decision, one conversation, and one relationship at a time. Daniel thought the company's greatest asset was an $18 million contract. He was wrong. The greatest asset was the trust behind it. And that was something no one could fire me from.